Hello, anyone watching, and good evening to Dr. Arthur Pape. How are you, Arthur?
Good, thanks, Clinton. Thank you for inviting me
Good
to speak tonight.
No, it's a pleasure, and of course you are a legend and a veteran of the fight for the rights of colour vision deficient pilots. And what's precipitated the particular issue that precipitated the decision to do this broadcast was the recent decision by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority to dump the operational colour vision assessment, the OCVA, which was implemented by the New Zealand CAA a few years ago, and Australia adopted it, and there was a lot of rejoicing to this enlightenment, and then without any explanation or notice to the industry, CASA recently just dumped that and decided to implement its own bright idea on the basis that it knows better. But we may get up to that. But before we do that, I mean, I know an hour or a whole day wouldn't be enough to briefly summarise the decades of your involvement in the fight for the interests of colour vision deficient pilots. But can you give us a potted history?
Sure, Clinton. I'll start by saying that I learned to fly in the late 70s. I took up learning to fly while I was a GP in the small country town of Swan Hill in northern Victoria. And I already had known that I was colour defective. And when I went for my medical, I failed the colour vision tests and asked the examiner, my medical examiner, what relevance that had, and he said, "Oh, well, you won't be allowed to fly at night." And I thought, oh, well, that's fine. But in those days, that was in the late 70s, early 80s, anyone who failed colour vision tests could still fly an aeroplane as a private pilot. They could hold a commercial license. They could not hold the ATPL, the Airline Transport Pilot License, and they were not allowed to fly at night, but they were allowed to hold an instrument rating. So I found myself in my early years as a pilot, I found myself holding a command instrument rating for a single engine aeroplane, with which, as you know, you can fly around all day long in thick black clouds and not see the ground for hours at a time. But come nightfall, I was considered so dangerous, I could not have my hands anywhere near the controls of an aeroplane. And that was even to the point where I was unable to undertake any night training with a colour vision normal instructor. Now, that struck me as very strange. But anyway, in the couple of years that followed, I got my license, my instrument rating and commercial license, and I was enjoying flicking around the countryside, usually on medical excursions. And I was flying one night with a friend of mine from Swan Hill to Melbourne, to Essendon in Melbourne. He was the pilot in command and I was just a passenger, but I noticed that the things I was not supposed to be able to see, that is, the whereabouts of Essendon and Melbourne airports, and the presence of other aircraft in the sky, and the presence of runways versus taxiways, and all the things that they had predicted I would have trouble with. I thought, this is crazy. I can see everything I need to see, and I think I should be able to do this. So I approached the then DCA medical officer, Dr. John Lane, and he confessed to me that he didn't understand either why these restrictions should occur. But not to worry, he was going to commission some investigation or some research by the College of Optometry in Melbourne at Melbourne University, and to try and resolve the dilemma that I was putting to him. And I was a very patient person in those days, and I waited and waited. And when eventually the College of Optometry produced its research results, it was very much in favour of even stricter colour vision standards, because they found that colour defectives were not reliable at all in naming colours. Now, that by definition is what a colour defective is. You are labelled colour defective because you fail colour vision testing, and that usually involves discriminating between pairs of colours, not being able to say, for instance, whether something is pink or light green. Now, the long and the short of it is that eventually I took this matter to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and that was heard in 1986 from memory. And I won the right at that hearing to be allowed to fly my aeroplane, the single engine aeroplane. At night, I could use my instrument rating. The minima, if I was to use the instrument rating at night, were somewhat higher than was regular for people with normal colour vision. But I was told in no uncertain terms by the then DCA that, yes, well, you know, I'd won, but they weren't going to pass this on to anyone else. So that, in short, then led in the next few years to the setting up of an appeal, not just for one pilot. It was nominally in the name of a pilot called Jonathan Dennison, but every bit of evidence was in relation to all classes of CVD pilots, CVD meaning colour vision defective. And we won that as well. And as a result of that, colour defective pilots of all grades eventually were able to fly at night. There was a period of relative enlightenment when we had a PMO, a principal medical officer, called Rob Liddell. And Rob Liddell started receiving applications from people, Australian pilots who'd been forced into going overseas, usually to the United States, where they could still get the ATPL, they could further their careers. But now that they heard about the Dennison case, they wanted to come back and be able to continue their careers in Australia. And Rob was faced with the dilemma of either knocking them back because that wasn't quite covered by the Dennison decision, or to say, well, yes, it's rather compelling that you've got 15,000 hours in heavy transport aircraft, flying all over the Pacific and all over the United States and more. So he started handing out ATPL licenses to CVD pilots, some with some limitation, but many of them without any limitation. And with that, we started to develop a group of pilots, and it became sizable in time, that were severely CVD, but had a spotless record in terms of their safe performance. He was followed sometime later by another PMO who continued that, and things were running very smoothly. We had hundreds and hundreds of CVD pilots at all levels within the industry operating in Australia. And not a single scratch to an aeroplane happened as a result.
I'm always struck by it's just pure historical coincidence that aviation came after marine navigation. And so there was the Navigation Act and the marine orders under the Navigation Act. And of course, marine navigation in the 18th and 16th century and eventually started using colour as a means to colour itself as having a meaning. And so when aviation started, they went, well, we'll now have an Air Navigation Act and we'll have civil aviation orders, all based upon marine navigation, which in its inception used colours as a fundamental way of presenting information. Now, in aviation, it's particularly civil aviation, the colour initially had some meaning, like the lights on the ends of wingtips when aircraft flew quite slowly. But very quickly, civil aviation developed and evolved to a point where the significance of the colour itself disappeared. And for example, all the old steam-driven instruments were all black and white, weren't they?
Yes. Yeah, you're right. And the thing is that as this is happening, we're now talking about hundreds and hundreds of pilots with CVD who some years earlier would not have been allowed to fly a Cessna at night. And they're now operating at all levels. CVD pilots who couldn't get the ATPL were nevertheless allowed to operate in jet aircraft as a first officer. Now, the training that they had to do was exactly the same as the captain of the particular heavy-bodied jets. But what prevented them from being able to become a captain was that they couldn't pass the final test, which was in those days a control tower signal gun test. And the worst, let me say too, that colour defectives come in a variety of grades. So there are basically three types of colour defective groups. One is where the green receptor in the retina is deficient or absent. I happen to be one of those. I'm a deuteranope. I'm missing the green receptor totally. Another one is where the red receptor in the retina is either deficient or missing altogether, and they're called protonopes. And the third is where the blue receptor is deficient or absent, and they're called tritanes. Now, the point is this, that there was one particular pilot. So we had my case in the AAT, and then the Denison case, which was treated by the AAT as a test case on behalf of all colour vision defectives. And the third case was a fellow called John O'Brien, who was a protonope. And in colour vision circles, he represented one of the worst kinds of colour vision defect you can have. John, under the concessions that Rob Liddell had tailored, John was able to become an instructor, an examiner, and he taught other pilots to fly at night. He taught them their instrument ratings, and he was able to test them in their instrument rating and license applications. So John built up quite a reputation for himself as a very, very high quality pilot, and he was endorsed by the operational people, those that issue the certificates for examiners of airmen and for simulator instructors and examiners and so on. And John has a very, very impressive curriculum vitae in terms of his aviation career. But he was prohibited from becoming the captain in the Dash 8, where he had been a first officer for a very long time. So he went to the AAT, and so the third case was John O'Brien going to the AAT and being granted the right to be the captain of a heavy transport aircraft. This case in particular was fought very vehemently by the then director of medicine, or the PMO, the principal medical officer, and CASA in general. They threw everything at John to try and stop him even having a hearing. One of the things that came up during it was that there had been a new test come out of the UK called the CAD test. Now, the CAD test was supposed to be aviation specific. It was supposed to be unlearnable. You couldn't learn, like it is possible to learn the Ishihara confetti test book, but you can't learn a CAD. It's a computer-based diagnostic system where you get a diagnosis. It's very accurate, and and CASA implemented it as a practical test, the third tier of testing to see whether you'd be a safe pilot. And before I go any further, I'd want to say that the colour vision standard for aviation requires of any candidate that they be able to readily discriminate and recognise those colours, the recognition of which is necessary for the safe performance of a pilot's duties. Now, this has an implication that colour is important in being able to perform safely. We've always argued, no, that isn't the case. What is important to know to fly an aeroplane safely are the practical issues of how much fuel you've got, what your airspeed is, what your speed limitations are, what your rate of climb is, what your angle of bank, pitch and roll are, and so on and so on and so forth, even down to the menu for the lunch in the cabin behind you. You know,
yes.
These are the important things.
The important thing is to know what things mean. Now, those
Yes.
things might be coloured, but you need to know what things mean, and all of that history of safe operations should suggest to people with an open mind that maybe not being able to say that that's red or that's green isn't the important thing. It's to be able to know that light indicates I'm low on fuel, or that light indicates my engine's on fire. What colour the light happens to be is neither here nor
those three green lights mean, and those three lights there indicate that my gear is down and locked. And if there's another light there that is red, it is possible to determine that the gear is not down and locked without reference to the colour. The two displays are quite distinctive.
I think it was just when John O'Brien's case came up, that was in the context of CASA and the new PMO literally writing to operators and saying that there are all these people out there who've got medical certificates, but they are colour vision deficient, and this is a safety issue. And this is when I started getting interested in this, because I haven't got a colour vision deficiency, but I looked at all this and I thought, this is a return to the dark ages. And of course, the PMO at the time was notorious for a whole bunch of other things that he was doing and messes that we were making. And so I looked at the legislation and I looked at the CAD test, and I'll just flash up because it's not all that complicated. If I can master the technology, I'll just show the civil aviation regulations. Here's out of Part 67. I need to turn to read this, and it says this is for Class 1, and there's the same equivalent for Class 2, and these are the three tiers that Arthur was referring to. A person must demonstrate that he or she meets the criterion in item 139 of table 67-150, and that is that criterion is the colour perception criterion, and it says A, and this is the first tier, in daylight or artificial light of similar luminosity, readily identifying a series of pseudo isochromatic plates of the Ishihara 24-plate type, making no more than 2 errors, and that's the one that I pass. I can see the numbers, and I don't get any past that. Although I did notice there was an evolution where I used to go in and they'd share a few numbers, and obviously someone had said, "Oh, these people can learn this," and they're all presumptive cheats. And I ended up having to go through the whole thing, even tracing my line across snakes in this thing. And I go, "Why are you putting me through this? I can look at the numbers," and of course, because Avmed was saying these people are learning this test and they're trying to cheat. So there's the second tier is for somebody who makes 2 or more errors in the Ishihara test, readily identifying aviation colour lights displayed by means of a Farnsworth colour perception lantern, blah, blah, blah. That's the second tier test. Now, once you've got and you're the expert on this, but I assume that by the time you've failed both of those, you've identified someone who has a colour vision deficiency. So
Correct.
then there's the third tier test for somebody who does not satisfy paragraph A or B, correctly identifying all relevant coloured lights in a test determined by CASA that simulates an operational situation. So the third tier test is supposed to simulate an operational situation. And this, the CAD test to which you referred, and I'll see if I can flash it up, was supposedly introduced as this third tier operational situation. But I also note a little bit of language here. It says identify all relevant coloured lights in a test determined by CASA that simulates an operational situation. It doesn't require you to identify the colour. It requires you to identify the lights that happen to be coloured. So it's supposed to say, well, there's a light that's gone off. It happens to be coloured. What does it mean? Oh, well, my fuel's low, or the undercarriage is unsafe. So this is, I'll flash up now, the third tier test that CASA implemented, the CAD test. This is an operational situation. So everyone who watches this, strap yourself in the cockpit and just imagine that you're in the cockpit ready to fly, and here is the operational situation with which you are presented as the third tier test. I've just got to find it, share, here we go. There it is. Now, those of us looking at that will immediately spot that as the indicator screen for the turbo encabulator system. That's or maybe something like that. I don't know what it is. Now, for those of you who can't see the man dressed in the gorilla suit who's walking through the game of basketball, you must have a colour vision deficiency. So I looked at that and I thought, how on earth could anyone with any objectivity say that simulates an operational situation? But yet, wasn't that where CASA started sending everybody for that test?
That became the ultimate test, and that was supposed to be to satisfy the third tier requirement of a test with an operational flavour. It is sheer nonsense, and the CAD test is still. There's a lot we could speak for an hour just about the CAD test, but it's really fruitless. It is a very good, reliable clinical test of colour vision. It is not aviation specific. It certainly doesn't represent any operational scenario that any pilot is ever going to stumble across. And it doesn't answer the question whether you fail it miserably or not. It doesn't answer the question whether you can safely fly an aeroplane in all stages of flight. It is supposed to have been modelled on the colour vision requirements that they say you need to use the PAPI system safely. Now, PAPI stands for the Precision Approach Path Indicator, and it's a colour-coded approach path signalling system, which eventually took over in Australia from the TVASI, which was shape-coded. PAPI is colour-coded. The developers of this CAD test claim that they used the colours of the PAPI system in designing this test, and that made it, according to them, aviation specific. However, in the John O'Brien AAT hearing, the inventor of the CAD, Professor John, I've forgotten his name now, but the professor of the University College of London, had to admit that it wasn't aviation specific and that it is not a practical test. So everything that CASA has claimed, he was refuting. He had to under oath.
Well, it's patently obvious, and this is why it's so absurd. And can I say, one of the things that struck me about this, and the most surprising thing to me in delving into colour vision deficiency issues and the way that aviation regulators are dealing with it, is the patent intellectual dishonesty of it all. Even I mean, I know Avmed gets is on a crusade a whole bunch of things, but I was shocked at the patent intellectual dishonesty of what goes on with colour vision deficiency. And if we get a chance tonight, or maybe in a later broadcast, we'll talk about the Tallahassee 737 incident in the United States, because when I thought, well, the NTSB 2002 737 spears in, or crashes early, colour vision deficiency identified as a factor, I thought, well, this is pretty important. And I read it, and it's just, anyway, we will see. But then we had a period of, after O'Brien, a little bit of toing and froing, but there was a lot of work then done with the New Zealand CAA, who at that stage seemed to have people in it who comprehended the meaning of objective evidence and disinterested and dispassionate assessment of objective evidence and risk. And what happened in the NZCAA instance?
Well, actually prior to the John O'Brien AAT hearing, I had set up an association called the Colour Vision Defective Pilots Association, which was a not-for-profit organisation that would bring pilots affected by this and their families and anyone else who was interested in taking part in the discussion and debate, and also give us an opportunity to collect funding from people to fight the good fight. We were able to collect quite a few $1,000s from individual donors, and a lot of that went towards helping John O'Brien fund his AAT case. The colour vision defectiveness is widespread. It occurs in every male population in the world. And our friends in New Zealand had been watching the developments in Australia with envy, because they were under the influence of their PMO, who is a very zealous protector of colour vision standards. I went across there and gave them a lot of the material that we'd used in our various AAT hearings here, including the John O'Brien one. And they set up their own Colour Vision Aviators Association. And with that, they started lobbying the director over there, Graham Harris, of the CAA New Zealand. And Graham Harris understood that he understood the basic premise that safety of operations is an operational consideration, not a medical one. So in terms of colour vision, that is. And there are instances, I'll just digress a moment, there are medical conditions that have a direct bearing on safety. There are, absolutely. So somebody with uncontrollable high blood pressure, or with ischemic heart disease, or with a drug problem may well directly find themselves in a very unsafe situation. And that is because if you have a heart attack during an important phase of flight, then you are rendered incapable of doing anything, let alone flying the aeroplane safely. You may not even be conscious, you could be dead. So, and this applies to many, many genuine medical concerns in regard to pilot safety. However, as far as colour vision is concerned, the assessment is whether or not a pilot can safely operate the aeroplane, irrespective of the colour vision. And we had developed the cohort, as I said earlier, in Australia of many hundreds of CVD pilots operating without scratching a single aeroplane in the process. And John O'Brien joined me now as Captain John O'Brien, who was flying still for a regional airline in Australia, but he was now the captain of a Dash 8, and he became part of their campaign. At about that time, I became very ill, and I had to retire from the whole campaign for quite a while until I recovered. And John took over the reins, and he helped sway the New Zealand CAA into developing and adopting an occupational colour vision assessment. And that involved a candidate, and they didn't have to be highly experienced in their aviation field yet, but they could have an introductory session in an aeroplane and be asked questions like, how much fuel is there in the tanks? What is the airspeed that we're going at? How fast are we climbing or descending? And all of the practicalities of flying. And if they could answer those, it was prohibited by the examiner in that case to say, and what colour is that? Because that had no relevance to the safe performance. So Graham Harris and the New Zealand adopted this test. And at the same time, we in Australia had approached Shane Carmody, who was then a fairly new director of CASA. And he said he had a lot of sympathy for our position and that he was watching very closely what happened in New Zealand. And he said, if they pass it, we will follow suit. So that's exactly what happened. The New Zealanders adopted the OCVA. It wasn't meant to be a test of colour vision. It was meant to assess whether somebody could still, in spite of colour vision deficiency, recognise all those parameters that are essential for safe performance. And they did that in New Zealand, and we in Australia did it with very extensive industry consultation. All the airlines in Australia were on board with the change to adopting the OCVA until we got a PMO. I might be getting my times. No, a PMO pulled the rug out from under us before this OCVA. That was Dr. Navati, who claimed, as you said earlier, to have new evidence that made it clear to him that colour defectors were inherently unsafe. And so he turned us back not 40 years, because 40 years ago we could hold instrument ratings and we could hold CPLs. He just said no flying by day except under VFR and on a private license. And it was that took us back to well before the 1950s even. So Australia adopted the OCVA following on from New Zealand. And then out of the blue, a couple of years ago, we got John O'Brien and myself were asked were warned by the then new PMO and her offsider that they were going to review the OCVA. They had serious misgivings about it. It was an unvalidated, they said, test, and they were going to hold a review. John and I offered our services to join in the review process, but we were told, no, there wouldn't be enough funding for us to be part of that. And the rest of it was shrouded in mystery. We still don't know who was on the panel, what evidence they considered, how any of it ever came about, but we now have a mishmash of an ACVA, an aviation colour vision assessment, a different acronym, but it's a nightmare. And it all goes back again to the Pape and to the papers that have been discredited over and over in the AAT process. So we're back there, and that's why we're talking. Before that, everyone was passing the OCVA, and that bothered Avmed. How can you have a test that everyone passes? I would have thought that's a wonderful outcome. If you can take 1,000 young, barely experienced would-be pilots, and they can all reliably tell you that the tanks are full and the airspeed is XYZ kilometers or nautical miles or knots, whatever, and that the altitude is this and the angle of bank is that, then you'd be happy with that. And if then their training and their assessment by examiners of airmen, it's found that they can safely operate an aeroplane, they should be given the license.
Yes.
And that's a simple principle that I stand by. If I, there's a long history to colour vision, and there was a period where internationally there was a period in Japan in the early years of the century, last century, where people with colour vision defects just simply couldn't go to school. There was no point in the state paying for their schooling. They were so disabled.
Yes.
There are still countries around the world, I believe, that the Indian subcontinent has colour vision standards that prevent educational opportunities, and tertiary education requirements are that you must have normal colour vision. And it's just, it's a bizarre situation.
It's dark ages stuff. And
yeah, it is.
And I tell people the story. The Bonanza I used to own had an old undercarriage system in it, and for some reason the light that indicated the undercarriage was up was red. So it'd be green, one light green for down, and the up light would be red. And everyone would say, "Why is that red light on?" I go, "Don't worry about it. What it means is the light is that the undercarriage is retracted. Forget the colour. Forget the colour. All you need to know is the fact that it's illuminated is a good thing." And it's just it comes from, you can understand at one level, it's prejudice. The assumption is that the clue's in the name. There's a deficiency, therefore it must be a problem that results in some safety risk or people not being able to learn or whatever it is. But I've put in an FOI request to CASA to find out the basis upon which CASA and the evidence upon which CASA assessed the OCVA and decided, no, it's not good enough, and we're going to implement something else because if we pause to listen, we're hearing New Zealand aircraft plummeting to the earth or crashing into places because of what they're doing over there. It's just, and it just, looking at all of this stuff, it's just a typical situation that seems to me where you have people that they know in their heart of hearts, not in their brain, in their heart of hearts, that this is a safety issue and it's got to be, that's the conclusion. And now there's evidence that's got to be dug up so that we can prove, quote unquote, that it is a safety issue. And it'd be good if we could get John O'Brien on to talk about his experience and what he's flying. And no doubt there are thousands of people who could tell similar stories, but my observation is the zealots involved in this will just say they're just accidents waiting to happen. Not that they're competent and can do as competently through testing as someone without a colour vision deficiency. No, they're just an accident waiting to happen, because that's intuitively and in their heart of hearts what they believe, not what the evidence says. I mean, I wanted to, if you're in, the other thing that I did before when preparing for this is I went off and read that Tallahassee NTSB report again, and it is just so fascinating watching these things unfold and seeing the deliberate twisting and overemphasizing of some things and focusing on others and ignoring other things that went on in it. And it is just so obvious. That's what surprises me about this stuff. It's just so obvious in the way they go about things that they have a conclusion that they want to reach, and it's find evidence to support that, discount anything that's or downplay anything that's against the conclusion. And I'll flash it up. We'll see. I don't want to go on for too long. I'll see again if I can flash it up. But the reason I was so interested in it is, of course, as I said, it's the NTSB in the United States. It is fairly recent. It's a 727 aircraft, so it's not as if it's the result of some other third world country doing an investigation into a 172 crashing into a something. It's serious stuff. So that's why I thought, well, this is pretty solid stuff. But when you go into this, and I won't read out 130 pages, but for those who aren't aware of the background here, I'll just the executive summary. This aircraft, this is just before daylight on approach to Tallahassee in the 727. It effectively landed short. Fortunately, there were trees short, and in fact, we'll see that it was the recognised Black Hole Airport, which became relevant. And there were some injuries. The airplane was destroyed, but no lives lost. There were night visual flight conditions, VMC, but they were obviously on an instrument flight rules plan. NTSB determines that the probable cause of the accident was the captain's and the first officer's failure to establish and maintain a proper glide path during the night visual approach to landing. Okay, it's a fairly standard problem. Contributing to the accident was the combination of the captain's and first officer's fatigue. Fatigue's not a good thing. The captain's and first officer's failure to adhere to company flight procedures. Well, they're usually there for a reason. Captains and flight engineers' failure to monitor the approach. Now, the captain and the flight engineer was also a pilot, but happened to be a qualified pilot. Captains and flight engineers failure to monitor the approach. That's no good. And the first officer's colour vision deficiency, and that's what jumped out at me. So they're saying 1 out of the 3 pilots on the flight deck's colour vision deficiency was a factor in this accident. And when you go through this, it is just fascinating to see what happened. So all of these times at Eastern Daylight Savings times, and so early in the morning, very, very early, just before dawn, the first officer, this is the guy with the colour vision deficiency, he was the flying pilot, while the captain performed the non-flying duties for the accident flight. Now, according to the cockpit voice recorder and subsequent investigation, the weather information was scattered clouds at 100 feet, and it's also at 18,000 feet and 25,000 feet, wind from 120 degrees at 5 knots, temperature and dew point 22 degrees. Temperature and dew point 22 degrees. Now, when I was doing meteorology, when those numbers are close together or the same, that's not good. 30 inches of mercury. So it's now those kinds of conditions. What does your research indicate to you about? Well, we will see that this airport, they landed at. They had a choice of runway 27 and 09. They went on 09. Each had a PAPI. Now, you've done a lot of research into this. What are these kinds of weather conditions sometimes do to PAPI systems?
Well, I base this on a paper written by 2 people, Clark and Gordon of the Australian Defence Research Laboratories, before the PAPI was actually introduced into Australia. They investigated the construction of the PAPI, and they came to the conclusion that there would be serious risks associated with the use of PAPI under certain meteorological conditions. It so happened that those risks involved the presence of airborne water particles, such as haze, and that's more likely to happen when the dew point and the temperature are one and the same. The presence of dew on the lenses of the PAPI, which causes a scattering of the two beams. There are 4 lights in the PAPI, and each light is split into 2 beams of red below and white above. And the 4 lights are aligned in such a way that if you are very low, you will see 4 red lights. If you are very high, you will see 4 white lights. And the correct slope is indicated when everything's working properly, is indicated by 2 reds and 2 whites. And under the vast majority of instances, that's what everyone sees if they're on slope, including colour vision defectives. Now, in trying conditions, such as those that were exactly replicated at the Tallahassee accident site, the PAPI system can fail, and if it fails to give the correct indication that it should be giving, it fails unsafe. That is, what should have been seen as red can be seen as light pink. So these pilots, all of them, were under the illusion that they were too high because they had more whitish lights than the reality should have indicated to them. They were actually low, below the ideal glide slope, but the indications to the crew were that the rate of descent that was adopted by the flying pilot was appropriate because they were too high. And it wasn't until they came out of the bottom of this layer of haze at 100 feet, which is not very high in terms of a 727, that the complete redness of the lights became apparent to the crew. But by then it was too late. I delivered a paper to the Aviation Medical Society in Chicago in about 2012 on this topic. And the loudest screams of blue murder came from the people who had actually taken part in this NTSB investigation of this crash. There were lots of people in the investigation that had vested interests to protect, not least of which was the manufacturers of the PAPI systems. They suggested I shouldn't just rely on this report that we're looking at there, but that I should get the docket, which I duly did. It was easy to do. The NTSB sent me the complete docket, they call it, the total body of evidence that was available to them. And it's clear that there were errors made in the conduct of this investigation. The PAPIs were tested the day after the crash, in the middle of the day, with the sun blazing and no hint of dew anywhere. That's not, they didn't try to replicate the meteorological conditions that were present at the time of the crash. There are lots of things, but at the end of the day, what matters is that there were 3 crew and none of them saw the crash coming. It wasn't
none of them saw the crash coming, and all of them said that they looked out and they thought that what they were seeing was giving them good news. Yeah. But as to the PAPI, this is the investigation actually says this. The Safety Board, the NTSB, notes that the National Air Traffic Controllers Association submission on this accident stated that there was a, quote, high level of physical particle contamination on the runway 9 PAPI boxes at Tallahassee. The National Air Traffic Controllers Association made a submission to say that. However, and then this is the NTSB, however, in NTSB investigators who examined the PAPI boxes during the on-scene investigation noted no such contamination, and the investigation developed no evidence to support this contention. So here we have a situation where people with apparently first-hand knowledge said that there was contamination, and that's not evidence. So they go off there afterwards in the middle of the day or whatever. And also the other thing is that on December 12, 2002, the FAA issued Cert Alert number 0-28, quote, PAPI operation, unquote, which advised that 14 CFR Part 139 certificated airport operators should rewire pilot control PAPI systems to make them operate continuously in order to preclude environmental contamination of the lenses. The Tallahassee PAPI lights were subsequently required in accordance with the Cert Alert. Now, if there was nothing wrong with PAPI, there's nothing wrong and nothing to see here, then why would they have issued this Cert Alert requiring a change in the wiring of the PAPI? And I've had correspondence with people in Australia who say, "Oh yeah, PAPI in the outback and certain mornings at certain times of day, all you get's 4 pinks." And so you've got this situation where there are people putting in evidence saying that there's contamination and there's problems with this, and them saying no, it just didn't happen in this case. I can't for the life of me understand how this sort of analysis passes as evidence, because the first officer with the colour vision deficiency had flown in the Navy for 16 or 19 years. I'll have to check what it was, but he wasn't there peeling potatoes. He was in the Navy and being tested, and they knew he had colour vision deficiency, and he had one of these approvals to fly anyway. So it just fascinates me how much effort that they went in this investigation. They went off to the USAF, the Air Force over there. They cited some Melbourne University research. I don't know whether you're aware of the Melbourne University research. They even had a quiet word with the first officer's wife. "Oh, your husband's colour vision deficiency. Does he ever have problems, spotting what the coloured lights mean?" And the wife's response was, "Well, I know he had some sort of colour vision deficiency in the Navy, but nobody worried about it." The extent to which they had to go out of their way to add that final thing, the first officer's colour vision deficiency, as a factor in this accident. It just astonishes me. And I'll read the conclusions. So here we go. "The accident approach was not stabilised as the airplane descended through 500 feet above ground level, and the pilot should have detected this and performed a go-around." Pilots, plural. Remember, there were 3. "The approach to runway 9 at Tallahassee Regional Airport, which was flown over unlighted terrain and in night visual conditions, resulted in black hole conditions which likely contributed to the flight crew's failure to properly perform the approach." Flight crew, plural. "Precision approach path indicator lights such as those installed at runway 9 at Tallahassee are a recognised countermeasure for use in black hole conditions and should have been, but were not, effectively used to maintain an appropriate glide path by the first officer, who was the flying pilot, or by the captain and the flight engineer, who under the principles of basic crew coordination were in a position to receive this information and initiate a corrective response." So they're just saying, we don't believe any of you when you say what you were looking out at the window. All 3 of you who said what you were looking outside out the windows indicated everything was safe. No. You were not using the PAPI effectively. The PAPI was fine. And the captain was likely impaired with fatigue, existing, and then the first officer suffered from a severe colour vision deficiency. Blah 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 blah, and that gives them. Then that's the chink in the armour through which they can drive. Now we need to revisit colour vision deficiency. because this is just, it must be a bigger problem than we first recognised. And it just, as I say, it astonishes me what they do.
Can I say something now, leaving Tallahassee behind?
Sure.
Just to get back to John O'Brien, in the interval that I mentioned earlier, where colour defective pilots were able to hold the position of first officer in heavy transport aircraft. And so John was the first officer in a Dash 8, and other pilots with equally bad colour vision problems compared to John and myself were operating in heavy jet aircraft. John, after his win in the tribunal, went on to become captain, and he quite recently went to the United States, where he passed their occupational colour vision assessment. It's different from what we had in Australia, but he was able to pass it. And with that now, he is flying for a world freight carrier, one of the largest freight carriers in the world. And it's only in the last couple of months that he's actually become operational. And he has done approaches into LA International, into Dallas, Texas, into Seoul in South Korea, many flights into China and Anchorage. And did I mention Chicago? John is now living the dream and building more and more upon that safe record that he has already well and truly established. There was another.
And there were all those operations. There were all those operations in Cessna 172s. What is he flying?
He's flying the latest and the last of the production 747s. He's now flying a 747.
Yeah, they're pretty big.
They're very, very big. And the pilot, the co-pilot in the Tallahassee crash, who had the colour vision defect, went out and did the same operational colour vision test in the States, a civilian one, passed it, and with that he also started flying jumbos into and out of Europe, all the main capital cities around the world that he's flown into. But another case I want to bring to your attention is a pilot who couldn't pass the control tower signal gun test in Australia when that was in vogue, but he was able to be the first officer in jet aircraft, and he was offered a job flying a jet. It was a jet aeroplane, a small one that the banks used to do bank runs at night. And with a CPL, he was given a dispensation to fly this aircraft, single pilot, at night, all weather conditions, in and out of airports with PAPI and airports without PAPI. And it was just an incredible, one of the most amazing stories of what this guy did. He was a protanope, severe colour vision defect, and he did this for a number of years until recently, when it was in vogue, when he could do it, he passed the OCVA, and he's now operating in airline employment as well. So,
well, I suppose the colour vision deficiency zealots out there will be all saying they're all just accidents waiting to happen, and we've got to continue digging up evidence to prove it so that we can get rid of them. Well, we're nearly up to an hour, and it'd be good to chase up John O'Brien to see if we can talk to him.
Yes.
The FOI request that I referred to in CASA has been rejected, a constructive refusal, because they say it's too big a job, which seems surprising to me, because the process of considering the validity or otherwise of the OCVA and its veracity and its efficacy shouldn't take that long, and the analysis of the AVCA shouldn't take that long. But in any event, it's been refused. But I've gone to the Office of Australian Information Commissioner to seek review of that, given what I say is the public interest, given, as you say, how the percentage of the population whose lives and careers are played with by Avmed each time it changes the goalposts. So I'll keep people informed as to how that review goes. And if we can tee up another chat, including John O'Brien, I think that'd be very inspirational, as well as your story for pilots and prospective pilots with colour vision deficiency.
Now, I'd like to say in closing that CASA does not have a good record, except in short periods of relative enlightenment, a good record of recognising any of the judgmental errors that they've made in terms of legalities and what the law requires, e.g. the imposition of CAD as a so-called operational, as a test that simulates an operational situation. You know,
Yeah.
it is bizarre beyond words to make that claim. And
Yes.
CASA still sticks to that. The current regime in Avmed still sticks to that proposition, and it is bizarre. They still stick to the proposition that PAPI is an essential part of aviation safety. It is not, because if the PAPI fails, you do not have to abort the approach. You know, there are thousands of operations each week into airports around Australia where there is no PAPI in sophisticated aircraft. I have a vast amount of documentation that I'm willing to share with people, and will devise a way to give people a link into a store of those documents. I've had experiences over the years of giving many talks to aviation medical meetings, 4 to the International Congress of Aviation Medicine, always on the topic of colour vision. We have a group in the United Kingdom that is making headway there and getting solid support from some aviation medical people in the UK and in Europe. The United States is probably the best country to live in at the present time if you're colour vision defective and want to be a pilot, but it's not perfect. What they impose on people there is relatively easy to pass, but it still begs the question of the necessity to recognise particular colours in the pursuit of safe operations. Now, this campaign, I doubt very much if we can get CASA to go back on this process that they've started, and there is a strong possibility that that'll finish up in the courts again. And there, you know, this is the fact that CASA, the current regime in CASA, and particularly in Avmed, have no regard for the findings of 3 different AAT hearings speaks volumes. They cannot understand how anyone can disagree with them. It's simply, it's not in their genes, it's not in their genetics to be challenged and to lose. Now, this will almost certainly finish up again unless somebody intervenes from higher up in CASA and says this is wrong. The people who did the work in taking submissions from the entire industry are shocked at the developments that Avmed have put in place.
Yes.
So, you know, in due course, we'll need to revitalise the campaign to raise funds and proceed to further litigation. That is my guess.
Yes, it's very unfortunate because, as you say, these unilateral decisions made by individuals that have such profound effects on people's lives and career plans, and it's just done with such carefree carefree arrogance that, you know, they're just doing it. They just put safety of air navigation in a sentence, and that's all they need to do, and that's the job done. But my observation is Avmed does whatever it wants to, knowing that most people don't have the resources and energy and can't go through the stress of fighting them. And I've had a couple of fights with them about just blatantly unlawful behaviour, which, not my opinion, it was agreed by CASA in one case and found by the AOT in another, but that doesn't feed back into their thinking. They just keep doing it, thinking, well, that one individual's pulled us up and is a troublemaker and they've won. But ultimately, our opinion must prevail, and what we must do, what we want, must prevail, because we're doing it in the name of safety. It's a foregone conclusion that it must be good, and that is a fundamental problem. And unfortunately, particularly with colour vision deficiency, it's one of these things where members of the public, the average punter, will think, well, it's a foregone conclusion. The clue is in the name, and they've got that. You know, Avmed's got that formidable prejudice or ignorance on their side in doing what they do, and it's shouldn't happen in the 21st century in a civilized nation. But anyway, we'll just have to keep fighting the good fight. And thank you so much for setting aside some time for this. And I'll keep people informed as to when we might have, you know, volume 2 with an update and chats with John O'Brien, or whatever interesting things we can come up with.
Good. Thanks, Clinton. Thanks for arranging this tonight.
Oh, no, pleasure. And goodbye to everyone watching.